Hi, Gershom.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm doing just fine.
It's great of you to take the time on your whirlwind tour of America. I should say for our podcast listeners that you are Gershom Gorenberg, an Israeli journalist and author of the book The Accidental Empire, the much-lauded book The Accidental Empire. I'm sorry to say that your publisher did not succeed in getting me a copy of the book on short notice. But I've read so much about it that I feel I know more or less its contents, and I've also read so much about it that's laudatory that I feel I can safely say that it's a very good book, and I encourage our viewers to click on the link next to the screen that would allow them to buy it from Amazon.com. New York Times called it a groundbreaking revision that deserves to reframe the entire debate. I want to talk a little about the current context of the whole settler movement in Israel. The book is largely an historical account of how the settlements came to be. But before I do that, I want to ask you a question. You are, I gather, an Israeli citizen, but I think our more alert viewers may have noticed that you speak English with an American accent. So I gather you were born in America and then moved to Israel?
Yes, I was born in the United States and moved to Israel nearly 30 years ago.
Okay.
And I've been working there as a journalist and author for most of that time, and for a large period of that time actually covering the settlement issue and covering the wider interface of religion and politics, which is, of course, a major issue worldwide, but is a particularly fraught question when you're talking about a political conflict which is so overladen with religious issues.
Okay, and you write for the Forward now, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, as far as the current context, why the settlements matter, it seems to me pretty much every reasonable person now thinks that a two-state solution is what's needed in Israel, and there are practical and political obstacles to that on both sides, on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. It seems to me that probably the main obstacle on the Israeli side is the sheer existence of the settlements. I mean, there's now a considerable body of land in the occupied territory that is populated by Israelis, and that includes some land that the Palestinians hold pretty dear, such as East Jerusalem. First of all, do you share the assessment that the settlements are the biggest single issue?
Excuse me. Sorry, there's a bit of what you just said dropped out. But yes, the settlements, I would certainly say, are at least a key roadblock, perhaps the most important roadblock from the Israeli side to reaching a two-state solution. And I would agree that a two-state solution is probably the only way out of the conflict. It's a recognition that there are two legitimate national movements, both of whom have the same homeland. Since there's no way to photocopy that homeland and make two of them, then the only realistic way of reaching a resolution of the conflict is to divide that land. And the line which provides the baseline for such a division is the pre-1967 border, which would mean Israel giving up most or all of the West Bank for the creation of a Palestinian state. However, in the West Bank today, there are over 250,000 Israeli settlers living in what Israel would label as the West Bank. That's in addition to over 180,000 Israelis living in the parts of East Jerusalem that Israel annexed within a few days of the Six-Day War in June 1967. I would also note as an aside that there's over 16,000 Israeli settlers living in the Golan Heights, land taken from Syria in 1967, which has also been annexed. So we're talking about a very large number of people, and we're also talking about a momentum of growth in which the settlements continually grow. Essentially, we have a problem of a quagmire, and we have a problem that unless something is done to reverse the current momentum, Israel continues to stride ever deeper into the deep muddy of the settlement effort and of the West Bank. The problems for Israel involved in this are that on the one hand, if Israel continues to entangle itself in the West Bank, if the situation of ethnic entanglement, which is a sort of artificial Bosnia in the West Bank, continues, it's extremely difficult for Israel to pull out. On the other hand, if Israel holds the West Bank, we're reaching the point where we're approaching parity between Arabs and Jews in the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan, the land that's currently under Israeli rule. If at some point in the future the Palestinians stopped calling for a two-state solution and started calling simply for the right to vote within Israel, it could result in essentially a call for a binational state. Now, I think that would be a mistake for both sides, because I think that would be a recipe for continued violence between the sides, but it's certainly a danger to Israel's future. So in a very real sense, if you connect the dots, the settlements themselves pose a danger to Israel's future.
Okay, now, Gershom, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, so I'd ask you to speak up if you can, and if that doesn't work, I would just encourage you, if I ask you a question that you've already answered, just tell me to shut up and move on to the next question.
All right.
Could happen. Because I didn't catch all of what you said, but we don't have a great connection here, so I'll try to speak up if you will. And it seems to me, I mean, the question in terms of the kind of obstacle the settlements pose, the question isn't just, would the majority of Israelis let go of, most or all of them? I mean, the people who live in the settlements are a powerful political constituency, and not surprisingly, they're not eager to uproot themselves and destabilize their entire lives and move to a whole different milieu. And one thing I've always wondered is, the Camp David Accords, Yasser Arafat is commonly blamed because he kind of walked out and more to the point, didn't even make a counteroffer. But I've always wondered, was it clear to you that if he had signed on to it, they would have been able to sell that deal to the Israelis? Because that would have called for a lot of uprooting, right?
Yes. The exact map that Barak was offering the Palestinians has never been publicized. So we don't know exactly how many settlers would have had to move. But certainly those living deep within the West Bank would have had to. And by the nature of the political situation, those are also the ones who are the most hard-line ideological about living there. That is to say, the ones who would have been most likely to resist and possibly resist violently. So in terms of the settlers themselves, there's no doubt it would have been a major crisis and a major strain on Israeli society. Would the majority of Israelis have supported that? I think that if the option had been there in front of them, an agreement sitting in front of the public which offered an end to the conflict with the Palestinians, that in the general public it would have earned very strong support. That's part of the dynamic of these situations. If you had asked Israelis at the beginning or even the middle of 1977 if they were willing to give up all of the Sinai for peace with Egypt, I don't think you would have gotten majority support for that, because it was a theoretical question. But after Anwar al-Sadat came to Jerusalem and said, you know what, I am willing to make a full peace with the state of Israel, end the war between us in exchange for the return of the Sinai, that agreement garnered very wide public support. When it's concrete, when it's an actual possibility, and what it's saying is there's going to be a more peaceful existence for our children, I think most Israelis would take that. One of the great fears would be the internal conflict with the settlers. There's no doubt that is a frightening possibility.
Yeah, and I gather that the recent the withdrawal from Gaza represented a kind of a growing willingness of the Israeli people to basically let go of fairly large pieces of land. I mean, it was conceived as just the beginning of withdrawal, and was thought of by many as signifying their willingness to just let go of large pieces of land, certainly the majority of the settlements, in exchange for peace. And in that sense, maybe you could view it as a move toward moderation. On the other hand, my sense is that, maybe I'm wrong, but since the Lebanese encounter of, I guess it's officially called the Lebanese War, I don't know, of this summer, has there been within Israel movement toward the right, or has there not? I mean, that in conjunction with other things, including the perceived failure of the Gaza withdrawal to accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish.
Well, the problem built into the Gaza withdrawal is that it recognized that Israel could not go on ruling over the large Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip. But Ariel Sharon and Ehud Olmert, who came up with that plan, and Olmert, who originally expected to continue with unilateral withdrawal in the West Bank, had a very, very basic flaw in their thinking. And that flaw was that they wanted to impose the solution. They wanted to draw the lines to which Israel would pull back without negotiating with the Palestinians, because they were well aware of the fact that any negotiated agreement would mean a deeper Israeli withdrawal than what they wanted to agree to. The result of that was that the Gaza withdrawal did not create any kind of peace agreement. It did not serve to legitimize the moderate forces in the Palestinian government, and it did not leave a stable ruling power in Gaza after Israel pulled out. So the idea of pulling out was a positive one. The method that was used, unilateralism, just we'll decide where we'll impose the line on the Palestinians, was really an abject failure. The fighting this summer in both Lebanon, from which Israel had previously pulled out unilaterally, and in Gaza, showed that without a diplomatic agreement in force, without security safeguards as part of it, a unilateral withdrawal posed many dangers to Israel, which has essentially discredited the centrist solution that Olmert was proposing of unilateral withdrawal. I would say that the whole Sharon-Olmert plan was really a form of political snake oil. It was saying you can cure your illness without any of the side effects, without any of the pain of a real treatment. You know, we'll give up the land that we don't want, and we'll just tell the Palestinians that we're keeping the rest, and peace will miraculously break out. Well, it didn't work. So at the moment, those people on the right who had come around and favored Olmert's plan are disillusioned, and that looks like a movement to the right. On the other hand, the left is having a harder time promoting a negotiated settlement, a negotiated solution, because of the Hamas victory in the Palestinian elections. You could essentially say that the Islamic right has won in Palestine, and that they're less willing to negotiate, they're less willing to reach compromises. And that makes it more difficult for the left to point to the partner. I still think that there are ways in which Israel, in which moderate Palestinians, and for that matter in which the United States could encourage a negotiated solution. But those things are not taking place at the present time. And I would just mention here for an American audience that one of the key problems in pursuing that strategy of returning to the track of negotiation is the deep resistance of the current American administration to taking that direction.
Okay. As I said, I am having a little trouble hearing you, so this may be a case where I do actually ask you the question you just answered. I don't think so, though. It's just the question is: do you have a theory in that about what Sharon was thinking? I mean, it seemed like common sense that a unilateral withdrawal that was not perceived by the Palestinians as being a product of negotiation would be perceived as a triumph of Hamas, the triumph of terrorism. And it was, in fact, cast that way. And certainly over here in America, you know, Tom Friedman wrote the column saying exactly that. And I'm just wondering, do you think Sharon did not get that, or that he was just responding to Israeli politics, or that fundamentally, in some sense, his goal was really, he was just not focused on cultivating moderate elements on the other side, or what? Do you have a theory?
I think that Ariel Sharon built his career on I wouldn't even call it a theory, I would call it the deep personal commitment, stance that Israel could impose its will on the region. And that stance repeatedly led Israel into disasters throughout his career. He thought in 1982, for instance, that Israel could remake Lebanon, that we could engage in nation building, and he led Israel into a morass that I think every American could understand today after the Iraqi debacle just how dangerous that that theory was. He thought that by creating the settlements, and he was one of the main architects of the map of where settlements are located, that he could impose the Israeli presence on the Palestinian. And he again thought that he could pull out of Gaza unilaterally without any real negotiated settlement, and that the Palestinians would simply have to accept that. I think overwhelmingly that approach was a failure. It is certainly true that simply from the poll figures that Palestinians saw the Israeli pullout as a victory for Hamas. Had the same withdrawal taken place through a process of negotiation with moderate Palestinians and as a step toward full Palestinian independence, it would have instead empowered the moderate forces in the Palestinian political arena. The major goal that the Palestinians have is ending the occupation. The question is, who will be empowered by that taking place? And Sharon essentially empowered the radicals, the extremists. I think that the results are really tragic.
Okay, let me ask you one more question before we get into your book, because it's related to this very issue of how you cultivate, how you steer Palestinian politics toward moderation. And I've actually never read what your view is on this. I don't know what you'll say. We've had this argument on Blogging Heads TV about how the Hamas electoral victory should have been handled. My argument was that it was kind of hopeless to demand that Hamas reverse its long-standing ideological commitment to the end of an Israeli state overnight, especially in the face of kind of overt threats of financial, withdrawing financial resources, which is, of course, what we did. I personally thought, I'm cynical enough about human nature, I guess, to think that if you had rearranged the incentive structure, you could have steered Palestinian leaders gradually toward more moderate utterances until their policy had been, in effect, revised. At least, it seemed to me that was the better hope. Anyway, we did what we did. I've never heard what your view is on this. What's your thinking?
Well, I think the idea of putting some pressure on the Palestinians, at least to recommit themselves to previously signed agreements and to stop the violence, was reasonable. But the problem with the strategy, again, is that there was no carrot built into it. The policy backed by the American administration and certainly adopted by the Israeli government said, you, the Palestinians, have to agree to these conditions. But it's not at all clear what's going to happen when they agree to those conditions. Where's the carrot? Does that lead to serious negotiations toward final status? Is there a possibility built into that the settlements will be evacuated? Is there any sign of pressure from the American administration on Israel to keep its commitments, its repeated commitments to the U.S. government, simply to stop the growth of settlements? We're not even talking here about evacuating them yet. I think under those circumstances, it was logical that it would be very difficult for Hamas to respond. Now, the further factor here is that despite all of those problems, a process of very tense dialogue did in fact begin between Hamas and the more moderate Palestinian president, Abu Mazen, which was aimed at some sort of agreement which would allow them to share rule and return to negotiations. And it included a form of indirect recognition of Israel's presence, acceptance of Israel's presence, even if not ideological affirmation of that. And it would have allowed Abu Mazen to come back to the negotiating table and work toward an agreement in which at a later stage the Palestinians might have had to sign on full recognition of Israel, but they would have had to sign on it at a point where they were getting something in return. The reports that I've heard from various sources are that when Abu Mazen had his meetings in the United States, he was told in no uncertain terms, don't sign such an agreement with Hamas unless there's immediate and full recognition of Israel now. Which is to say that the American administration opposed any sort of compromise that could have gotten the process moving again. And I would just say that this is actually, it's quite stunning, the position that the U.S. government, that the U.S. administration is taking now. If I were to look historically, and I have looked historically through the documents at the position of American administrations between 1967 and January of 2001, you could basically say that there was a bipartisan consensus that there had to be a peace agreement between Israel and the Arab states, including an agreement with the Palestinians, that agreement would be based roughly on a return to the pre-67 boundaries with a possibility of minor border adjustments, and that such an agreement was in both American and Israeli interests and should be pursued and encouraged by American diplomacy. Now, within that long-standing consensus, there were two ways that the U.S. administrations or various administrations acted. Sometimes they pursued that actively, as under Carter, under Bush 1, and sometimes they were too distracted with things going on elsewhere in the world to be able to do so. For instance, during the Vietnam years, and former Johnson and Nixon staffers told me this explicitly, during the Vietnam years, the United States was simply too distracted by the Vietnam War to be able to put any energy into Middle Eastern diplomacy. As one Israeli strategic expert said to me, you have to remember that attention is also a limited resource. So that was the position up till 2000. The interesting thing is, the frightening thing is that for the past several years, since the Bush administration began, the American position has not been to take any active role in encouraging a negotiated agreement. And I would say that that is damaging not only to American interests, and it's also damaging to Israeli interests. I don't see that as a form of support for Israel, even though the administration constantly claims that it is, because Israel's long-term, most essential strategic need is to reach an end of the conflict with its neighbors.
Okay. Yeah. So let's get into the book itself. Now, the context, of course, for the beginning of the settlement movement is the 1967 war. It's a war of self-defense that Israel fights. It doesn't begin as a war of expansion, but then at the end of it, Israel has got a lot of new territory under military control. And now the news coming out of your book that I don't know if this was the first reporting of this, but I saw this depicted as news, was that there was an internal finding within the Israeli government that actually starting a settlement within the territory that it was now occupying would be in violation of the Geneva Convention?
Yes, that's correct. In fact, your summary as a whole includes a couple of important points. The war was unplanned. It was not expected by Israeli intelligence. The battle plans were very belated. The results of the war were completely unexpected. You also have to remember that until a few days before the war, Israel did not expect to be fighting on several fronts. It was expected that if war did break out, it would only be with Egypt. So this territory was captured without a strategic goal in advance. And then political solutions had to be invented afterwards. It did not follow von Clausewitz's rules that war is a continuation of policy by other means. This war did not continue an explicit policy. The policy had to be invented after the fact. And particularly in connection with the West Bank and Gaza, internally the Israeli government was very divided about what to do. There was a recognition of the dangers of ruling over a large Palestinian population, and there was also a deep historical connection to the land and a set of security worries about giving it up, particularly after the war. One possibility that arose was at least establishing a few settlements in the West Bank, particularly in places where Jews had lived before 1948 and had been expelled during Israel's 1948 War of Independence. And there was a debate about this all summer of 1967 in Israel. Apparently in September, Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol came to the conclusion that he did want to reestablish a couple of these Jewish communities in what had become the West Bank. And he turned to the legal advisor of the Foreign Ministry of Israel, the person who was essentially Israel's main expert on international law, a man by the name of Theodor Meron, brilliant young lawyer, Holocaust survivor, who had an amazing figure because he had not gone to school throughout his youth because he'd been in a Nazi labor camp. Immediately after the war, he came to Palestine, then Israel, completed his university studies, went on to Harvard and Cambridge, and returned and went into the Israeli Foreign Service. And in response to Levi Eshkol's question, he wrote back and he said, establishing Israeli civilian settlements in the what he called administered territories, that is, the territories taken in the 1967 war, would contravene the explicit provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So the Israeli government was told in advance that this would violate international law. Meron, I'll just say as an aside, Meron has since gone on in his career to become one of the world's experts on international law, and for the past several years has been one of the judges on the International Criminal Court for the former Yugoslavia. So he's really one of the world's leading figures in the field of the law of war. Meron left, intentionally or not, one loophole in his legal opinion. And that loophole was that temporary military bases were permitted under international law. So within a few days of receiving that opinion, Levi Eshkol announced to the cabinet, was really a fait accompli in political terms, that he was allowing the reestablishment of a settlement called Kfar Etzion between Bethlehem and Hebron, but that it would be attached to an arm of the army that created paramilitary outposts where the soldiers both farmed the land and also guarded the area. So officially, it was an army base. That was a ruse. That was not actually correct. The settlers were told to tell the press that they belonged to this branch of the army, but they actually had no connection whatsoever to the army, and it was a civilian settlement in every respect.
Well, did they at least bother to post some actual soldiers there? I mean, that seems like it would have been easy enough.
There wasn't anything except for the people doing guard duty from the kibbutz itself. There was a sign that was sent from the army to this reborn kibbutz that said that had the name of the spot and indicated that it was part of the army. And one of the original settlers told me there was a great sign. He said it was this big piece of wood. He said, so we took it down and we attached metal strips to the back, and we lay it down at the front of the dining hall so that when people came in for lunch from the fields, they could scrape their boots off on the metal strips. And that was the connection between the settlement and the army. Now, one of the things that also happened here was that Abba Eban, who was then Israel's foreign minister, was actually in New York at the UN when this happened, when he heard from the headlines that the government was planning to set this place up. And a panicked diplomatic cable was sent from New York to Jerusalem saying, what's going on? And Eban got back a cable saying, this is just an outpost of the army. And he and one of his assistants dutifully told the American government that. And by the next spring, the American government was beginning to figure out from the news reports that this was actually a civilian settlement meant to be permanent, had nothing to do with the army. And so a cable was sent back from Tel Aviv to Washington to that effect. And the State Department told the American embassy in Tel Aviv, please go tell the Israelis that we think settling in the occupied territories violates the Fourth Geneva Convention. So the Americans also clearly had that position at that time. But as I said, the American government, the American administration under Johnson and afterwards under Nixon, didn't do very much to press that position. For one thing, as I said, they were busy. As one old Mideast hand from the administration said to me, you got to remember we had a problem on a different place in the globe, meaning Vietnam. They just didn't have time.
Do you think part of the problem is also that, I mean, I agree with you that America has not been a good friend of Israel's in this regard. Do you think part of the problem was also that neither the Israelis nor the Americans anticipated how terrorism would ultimately become a grave and maybe Israel's gravest security threat? I mean, the settlement movement, I mean, one thing you document in your book, and this is the reason it's called The Accidental Empire, is that it's not as if there was a systematic strategy consistently behind the expansion of the settlements. On the other hand, to the extent that there were strategic considerations, I guess especially early in this settler movement, they tended to presuppose that the great threat to Israel's national security would be invasion from a nation state, which in fact the great security threat had always been up to that point. We now know that terrorism has become a serious national security threat, could become even more serious, much more serious, if terrorists acquire certain kinds of weapons. Do you think if people had appreciated that, what was coming back then, things might have turned out differently?
Well, I think that in general the decisions were being made in a very short-term way. There were various reasons that political paralysis had set in the Israeli government after the '67 war. And there was an inability to make big decisions, and so little decisions were made instead. In a lot of ways, it's a lesson in how putting off a decision becomes a decision. The placement of some of the settlements was supposed to provide protection against an invasion of a regular army. That was based on a strategic way of thinking that was already 20 years out of date when it was adopted. The whole nature of setting up the settlements, I would say, was poorly thought out in terms of the conditions that Israel found itself in 1967. But I think another reason that the Americans didn't intervene is that the people handling this from Washington were diplomats, and they tended to look at the diplomatic formulae as being the important thing that another country was saying. In the Israeli political cultural context, what you did on the ground was what you really meant. And the statements around the tables in conference rooms were really much less important. The attitude was to speak softly and carry a big hoe. Start settlements, don't say too much about it, and that will establish the realities later on. And it took a very long time, I think, for the American government to catch on to that cultural difference. I would say, by the way, that that's an interesting lesson that goes beyond the American-Israeli situation. The political background to why the Israelis related to things that way was easily available to Americans studying the region. All of the important texts had been translated into English. They had experts who read Hebrew. They could have understood this, but it was such a different way of looking at things that they didn't. And I think if they couldn't get that difference with Israel, is it any real surprise to us that so many mistakes have been made dealing with countries where the political culture is different to a greater degree from that of the United States?
Yeah. Now, as I said, it was not, the settlement movement was not entirely by any means, a strategic thing, although it was partly that. And one thing I think you document in the book is that as time went on, it acquired an increasingly religious cast, at least along certain dimensions.
Well, what happened was that the leaders of the State of Israel in 1967 were in many ways harking back to their youth before the State of Israel was established, when creating new farming communities, kibbutzim, and other communal settlements was one of the main things that Jews did in order to hold on to their homeland. And there was an expectation from the middle-aged and older leaders of Israel that a new generation of Israeli youth would be really excited about the opportunity to do this. And they were wrong. The younger generation looked at that as, with about as much excitement as if I offered you a chance to, cross the Great Plains in a wagon train. And if you did agree to do that, you might do it for the fun for a few weeks, but you wouldn't expect to have to start plowing with 2 mules when you got to the other side. That's history. So recruiting young secular Israelis from the majority of Israel for new settlements was a failure. At the same time, young religious Israelis were very willing to sign up for this effort for a couple of reasons. One is that they had been in many ways left out of the heroic era. They thought that this was a way to make themselves the heroes again. They were reliving what they had missed previously. And the second thing is they were equipped with an ideology that made sense out of settlement, that made settlement something fraught with importance. And that ideology said that the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and particularly the victory in 1967, were signs that God was leading the world to the end of history, that the Messiah would come, that the prophecies of the Bible would be fulfilled. And they were being fulfilled in the sense that the Jews were returning to all of their homeland, and to settle in the occupied territories, what they would have called the liberated territories, was for them a way of getting with the plan, of being on God's side. And that's very exciting. So
and,
there was
can I ask you, what is the conception of kind of the end times from a Jewish perspective? I mean, Christians look at the book of Revelations, and I guess, is the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Scriptures the thing that's kind of, by fundamentalist Jews, I mean, is that what they look to for guidance? And in any event, are we talking about a kind of violent, chaotic, apocalyptic scenario, as some Christians believe in, or what?
There is a problem in using the word "the" in that sentence, as in what is the Jewish conception. There is no single Jewish conception of what the end of history is. There are a number of competing variations and stories. The book of Daniel is in the Jewish scriptures. It's a book which gets singularly little attention in Jewish study. There is a general common denominator to the various ideas of the end of history, that at some point God will help create a perfected era where the problems of our times, of war and of poverty, will be erased. And then one of the problems that's also going to be erased is the fact that Jews live in exile, that they do not live in their homeland. Rather, Jews will return to their homeland and be sovereign over their fate.
I guess one reason I'm asking is because what scares me about some American Christian fundamentalists is that their conception of the end times leads them to welcome instability and violence in the Middle East, because that's part of the picture from their point of view. And that to me is a politically dangerous fact that somewhat influential constituency in America, or at least a fraction of it, looks at things that way. I'm wondering, are there a significant number of Jewish fundamentalists who not only see the settlements as a sign of God's bringing on the end times, but would almost welcome violence as further evidence and a further stage in the unfolding? Or is that mainly a Christian thing?
The texts that I've seen very rarely, if ever, are looking forward to a violent outburst. But what does happen quite often is that when there has been a round of violence, it is easy to dig up verses that will explain, that will make sense out of this as being part of God's plan. So that, for instance, after the 1973 war with Syria and Egypt, there were certain rabbis who said, we can understand this as part of God's plan and it's okay. In a deeper sense, I think one of the problems with this approach is that it tends to look for peace as being such a perfect state that peace, as is understood in the pragmatic political realm, is always looked at as being too little. If you're looking for a totally perfect peace in which, really the wolf lies down with the lamb, then a cold peace with Egypt just doesn't qualify, for instance. So it raises the stakes too high, and it produces a certain amount of cynicism toward political agreements and arrangements. In that respect, I think that it's dangerous. I would say that and I made a study of the similarities and differences here in my previous book, which is called The End of Days. The amount of violent imagery of the end in the writings of certain Christian fundamentalists is really astounding. A colleague of mine referred to it as the pornography of violence, and I think that that's true. There's a real relishing of the violence and of the bloodshed.
Well, if you've read Revelation, you clearly have read Revelation, so you know where some of that comes from.
Right. It's clear where that comes from in Revelation, but you have to remember that when you're looking at a sacred text, there are two elements. There is a set of writings, and there's a human being interpreting it. And there are many, many different interpretations of those texts. So somebody who reads that text and says, this isn't poetry, this is a one-to-one literal description of events, is choosing that interpretation.
Yeah, no, I agree that, and one of the big policy challenges is to arrange circumstances such that people are more inclined to interpret their scriptures benignly.
Absolutely.
So anyway, as for the history, so there was a religious dimension early on to the settler movement. So was it the kind of then was it later that a primarily strategic calculus became dominant for a while? I mean, certainly that was Ariel Sharon, to the extent that Ariel Sharon used to be identified as kind of the father of the settlement movement. And one thing I think your book probably suggests is that that's too simple. But anyway, he was influential, and his calculus was fundamentally strategic, right?
His calculus was strategic and nationalistic. He intended to prevent Palestinian independence. His goal was to break up Palestinian territory such that it would be impossible to create a viable independent state. He was aiming to leave small Palestinian enclaves between what he called the fingers of Israeli settlement, thereby weakening the Palestinians, and then would assign some sort of very limited autonomy to those enclaves. It was a conception that involved imposing one's will on the other and expecting the other to accept it. When in fact the opposite happened, it encouraged greater violence and greater opposition. But he saw that as a strategic formula throughout his life. And I would say even at the end, when he made the decision to withdraw from Gaza, it was not that Sharon was abandoning the conception he'd had his entire life. He was revising it. He was making some corrections in it. He called the pullback from Gaza disengagement, which is a very military term. It means I'm pulling back, I'm disengaging from my enemy for tactical reasons. It was not a recognition of the need to make peace with the Palestinians.
Okay. It used to be said that, getting back to the kind of the current predicament, it used to be said that Israelis were better at Americans than understanding the Palestinian point of view, at least some sizable fraction of Israelis. Because for one thing, their sons and daughters would serve in the military. They'd come back from the occupied territories and say, listen, this isn't a good situation. I mean, this is kind of intrinsically humiliating. You have these young Palestinian workers. They have to go through a checkpoint every day, be interrogated by someone their age who is an Israeli and is kind of defined as the enemy, and so on. And there are these various really bad aspects of it. Is it your sense that ability persists among Israelis, even in light of kind of a depressing series of events lately and really for many years now, to see things from the Palestinian point of view?
I think there's a significant part of Israeli society that tries to do that. I think that ability has been deeply damaged by the violence of the last 6 years, both because the terror attacks within Israeli cities damaged Israelis' trust in the possibility of reaching peace, fanned hatred, created a sense of why are these people acting this way? How could they send their children to blow themselves up? All of those things widened the gap between Israelis and Palestinians. Another thing in purely physical terms is that since the second Intifada, the second Palestinian uprising began in 2000, most Israelis outside of the settlers have simply stopped visiting the West Bank. And so the level of human contact and simply of seeing what's going on has been reduced. And on another level, partly simply because of the growing size of the Israeli population and therefore the number of men available for military duty, there are fewer and fewer reservists serving in the West Bank, which means that you have a lot more young people, 18, 19, and 20 years old, doing that work there, really separated from civilian society to a much greater extent. And fewer of the reserve soldiers who used to go for a month at a time and then come back and talk with their families. So that's created a wider human gap. On the other hand, I think that your initial comparison remains true. Israelis are living in the Middle East. Some of them are frustrated with that. There's no doubt about it. I happen to think it's great to be living in the Middle East, but Israelis are living in the Middle East, and they're living next door to Islam, and they're living with Arabs, and that's part of daily life. And I think that the perception and the desire to understand is greater than it has been from Washington, certainly in the last several years.
And what about on the other side, the ability of Palestinians to appreciate the Israeli perspective? I mean, I'm sure from the beginning it was a quite different perspective. I assume, although I've actually never looked into this, that a good number of Palestinians, for one thing, do not accept the premise that from Israel's point of view the 1967 war was a war of self-defense. I mean, just given the way nationalist psychology works, especially among people who consider themselves disenfranchised, I would assume that the difference of perspective begins around there. And correct me if I'm wrong on that, but more broadly, is there? I mean, certainly, just looking at the news, the nightly news doesn't fill you with the belief that there are tons of Palestinians who are making a point to look at things from the Israeli point of view.
I think that the Palestinians living in the occupied territories have a very, very complicated relationship with Israel. They have a completely different telling of history. It doesn't just start in 1967. It goes back to the beginning of the conflict. It certainly involves how they see the war in 1948. So their own national story conflicts with the Israeli national story at all sorts of places. And yet, they are in constant human contact with Israelis. They are exposed to the Israeli media. The educated ones know who's who in Israeli politics. They very often express an admiration of Israeli democracy as a goal for themselves, even as they protest the way in which that democracy has oppressed them. So it's a complicated relationship. It rejects very basic parts of the Israeli story, and yet the Israelis are there as people. That relationship is not as complicated, or it doesn't include as many of the positive elements when you're dealing with those Palestinian refugees who are living in other Arab countries and haven't had such direct contact with Israel, and who can fantasize more about the idea that they're going to come back and Israel is going to disappear. I think that in the occupied territories there's a deep recognition that Israel isn't going to disappear. Even if it's not accepted ideologically, it's accepted de facto as a reality, and the question is how to make living with that reality more acceptable for Palestinians.
Uh-huh. I mean, one kind of, in some ways, disturbing symmetry, I guess, is that in both cases, something that began as fundamentally secular has become more and more religious. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. I'm not against religion, but in certain of its manifestations, including fundamentalism, can be kind of disturbing. And do you agree that complicates the problem on both sides now?
It definitely does. I would also note that even when the struggle was defined in very secular terms, both sides exploited and integrated religious symbolisms into their story. I mean, simply the focus on Jerusalem already tells you that, because Jerusalem has been the symbol of independence for both Palestinians and Israelis, and it's really a way in which a religious story has been adopted and adapted as a modern secular national story, so that the city has become sacred to secular national movements. From there to religion taking a major role was an easy step. But I would also note that the shape that religion takes is affected very deeply by the political circumstances. So that I do believe that if there is a greater hope for reaching a reconciliation, for reaching a way of living side by side, that will also affect the way religion is expressed. The extreme forms of religion that we're seeing right now are not only causing the conflict, they are very much a result of the conflict. And a change in the direction politically will also affect religion. Religion is not stagnant. It is not cut into, unlike the image of the Ten Commandments, it's not cut in stone. It shifts with the social and political circumstances, and it will be altered by, for instance, reaching peace.
Okay. You sound like you're probably more optimistic than the average Israeli or American. On that note, one thing the New York Times review of your book said was that the historical analysis in your book, The Accidental Empire, was itself cause for hope. I mean, the final sentence of that review is, by showing the root of the problem, incompetence, not ideology, Gorenberg points to the direction from which an answer may someday emerge. Now, one response to that would be, well, whatever the roots were, it has become a pretty deeply rooted problem. I mean, for one thing, as we just said, there's now a big religious dimension. Do you share the view of the reviewer that your history of the settlement movement should give us some hope about undoing some of the damage?
Well, I would agree only in the sense that, this is the historian's hope, is that by understanding a problem, understanding the roots of the problem, you're more capable of dealing with it. By understanding that certain decisions were made without knowing their consequences, it might be easier to convince people to rethink those decisions. By seeing that some of what's going on today was the subject of warnings nearly 40 years ago after the original conquest, it might be easier for us to accept those warnings today. I do think that looking into the origins of a problem can sometimes help people psychologically accept the need to take on a new direction. For that matter, I assume that that's why so many people are trying to figure out how the Iraq mess began, because some sort of understanding of what went wrong at the beginning psychologically makes people more prepared for the solution.
Okay. As if I wasn't having enough trouble understanding you, they've cranked up the leaf blowers in my neighborhood. I've had my hand up to my earpiece, holding it in the whole time. I mean, if you left America 30 years ago, you may remember the singer Joe Cocker.
Right.
Do you remember how he used to hold his hand up to his ear while he sang For Mysterious Reasons? I've been doing a 50-minute Joe Cocker impression. And just on grounds of how tired my hand is, we're going to have to end this in a few minutes. But I want to quickly ask you a couple more things. One is just, if you are an optimist, can you paint me a plausible scenario by which over the next few years we could really start moving toward a two-state solution?
Well, first of all, I want to say something about optimism. I think that pessimism is a stance which is destructive. I like to say that I simply don't have the luxury of pessimism. Pessimism is saying, I'm not going to cure this illness. I don't believe in that kind of fatalism. I believe in that you've got to look for the openings to make the change, because if you don't start off with the assumption that it's possible to find them, then you're certainly not going to find them. So the optimism is a choice. I would say that there are ways in which both sides could move toward achieving more of their goals. I think, for instance, that the so-called Saudi initiative, which is still being tossed around among the Arab countries, it's not a perfect solution to the problem, but it provides at least an opening for some sort of negotiations. I think that if outside powers got more involved in the discussions, that they could have some influence on what's happening. The push is really to put back on the table a two-state solution, to make it clear to both sides that that's the way out. From an Israeli perspective, I think that what the Israeli government should be doing now is, first of all, announcing its commitment to a two-state solution. It should be going over its own account books in order to find all the hidden places where money is being funded to the settlements, and to stop that in order to stop the growth of the settlements, and to make it clear that it's doing that for Israel's own good, and that the Palestinians have the opportunity of reaching peace if they're willing to come forward in the same way. There is no group of people that has more influence on Israeli politics than the Palestinians, And I believe there's probably no group of people who has more influence on Palestinian politics than the Israelis. So rather than waiting for the other side, each group should make its own steps toward peace, and therefore will influence the other side to come closer to the table and to come closer to the negotiations that are necessary for each of us to get out of this and to give a better life to our children.
Okay. Kind of a last question. Maybe it's two questions, but one thing, I'll lump them together, and you can answer them as you will. One thing that is said, one cause for alarm that some people see is, I've heard that if you look at the demographics of Israel, as things have gotten tougher and tougher there, it has tended to be the case that the people leaving Israel, the people just relocating, are more likely to be moderates, and the people coming to Israel, including from America, are less likely to be moderates. So that there's been, on balance, a radicalizing of the population. I'm wondering if that meshes with your perception. I'm also wondering why you moved to Israel 30 years ago, what you expected to find there, how your motivation does or doesn't differ from the motivations of people who are going there now, and kind of how it's worked out from your point of view. That's a lot of questions. So take what you will of that.
Well, first of all, I think that there has been a media perception of American immigrants to Israel as all being very right-wing. And it goes back to, it can be understood through the title of an old journalism book, which was, "Has anybody here been raped and speaks English?" The foreign correspondent, particularly the one with the camera, goes looking for somebody who can speak into the microphone in the language of people listening. So somebody goes out with a camera to a settlement and finds the one person there who speaks English, and that becomes the spokesman for the settlement. And you get the very, very warped perception that Americans are the bedrock of the population of the settlements, and that's simply a media illusion. What is probably true is that, at least when we're talking about the small number of American immigrants to Israel, is that you're likely to get people who are more committed to ideology as part of their life than the general Israeli population, because Americans come to Israel out of belief. They're not coming there because they're refugees. They're not coming there because they were forced out of where they lived before, which is true of many other Israelis. So there's a selection among Americans coming to Israel to people who have strongly held beliefs. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother to make the move. When I came to Israel, I would say that there were two things that convinced me to stay. One was I felt that it was very positive to be in a place where Jews were the majority of the society and therefore were taking responsibility for the decisions as Jews. That there was no gap in my existence between my concerns with the general society and with Jewish society, which, as a member of a minority in the United States, there always had been. Which cause am I going to be involved with today? The Jewish cause or the general American cause? In Israel, that division, that schizophrenia, disappeared. And the other thing I would say is I enjoyed the fact that Israel is a very politicized society. It's a place where politics really matter and where involvement really matters. I came to Israel in the 1970s, in which, at a time in which it seemed in America that everybody was treating politics as a hangover that they were trying to get over so that they could just get back to their own lives. And I was interested in being in a place where people were still concerned about general issues, about the issues of the society as a whole. And that remains true to this day. It's simply, as a political person, I find it a very, very exciting place to be living, and also to be writing and to be covering as a writer.
Okay. Now, as I said, it's getting harder and harder to understand you. Do I correctly take that silence to signify the end of your utterance?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
you aren't mishearing.
On that note, first of all, I really want to thank you for taking the time. I'm sorry the connection has been bad. It may be fortunate from your point of view. I think I tend to be a little too interactively interventionist in conversation and kind of step on people's toes. So maybe you should count yourself lucky that I haven't been able to hear what you're saying. Certainly gives me reason to look forward to watching the interview, so I'll see what you did say. And in any event, I just want to repeat that everything I've read about your book, The Accidental Empire, has been favorable. And now we know that there's another book of yours to read. It's called The End of Days?
It's called The End of Days, Fundamentalism and the Struggle for the Temple Mount. And it deals with the role of fundamentalism in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in feeding the conflict in the Middle East. And in particular, it devotes a considerable amount of space to the very strange relationship between the American Christian right and Israel.
Okay, well, it sounds like it's plenty relevant reading. Well, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your whirlwind tour of America.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.